Hello, I'm Steph from iDriver Classic, and as many of you know, I am Morris Minor mad, and I've been given the opportunity today to share a Morris Minor with you that perhaps you've never seen before. First of all, you've probably noticed that the steering wheel isn't on the side it usually is when I take out these Morris Minors, and that's because this is a Canadian export from 1949. Now you're probably looking at it and saying, Steph, what's it doing in a field in the West Midlands? Well, I'm going to tell you that story today, talk to you all about the car, and you'll even notice those New York plates on the back, and I'll explain all of that too. This is very different to a later Morris Minor and incredibly rare as well. So if you've only ever seen the later ones or perhaps the ones in between, buckle up because we are going on a bit of a history lesson. First of all, let's tackle the story behind this car because it's one of the most interesting things about it. The current owner, John, is a well-respected motoring writer, and in March 2015, he wrote a piece for the British Saloon Car Club of Canada about 1949 Morris Minors. Now, you might think this is strange that an American is waxing lyrical about the joys of an early Morris Minor, but John has been around Morris Minors his entire life, and he even still owns his father's 1960 Morris Traveller. He's also got another 1949 Morris Minor, and I think it's the oldest American saloon, a man who clearly is a glutton for punishment. Now, years pass after John writes this article, and then in 2020, John receives an email from a lovely man in Canada, and he told John all about his parents' Lowlight, which was a 1949 example. And he then moved on to saying that after his father's passing, he'd kept the car and he'd really toyed with selling it, but hadn't actually got around to doing it. And obviously this piqued John's interest, and the pair then exchanged emails. And quickly John realised that this car, the car that we're in today, was something rather special, because not only was it excruciatingly original, it was a rare survivor, which had an astonishingly correct and documented 19,000 miles from new. But Steph, how rare is this car, I hear you ask? Well, first of all, lowlights, the name given to cars such as this, where the lights are lower in the wing compared to highlights, similar to mine where the lights are higher, were only sent to Canada for 1 year. So that's 1949. It was believed that around 3,000 were sold and only a handful, fewer than 10, survive today. So the numbers are there for you on paper. And by the way, in case you didn't know this already, and this is one of the favourite things that I found out whilst doing research for this video, Nuffield didn't actually make very many Morris Minors in the January to June period of 1949 because they incorrectly predicted that the larger Morris Oxford would be more popular, and therefore they hadn't tooled up and prepped all their workshops to meet the surprising demand for the Morris Minor. Now, they move on quickly, they sort all that out, but there's something else, because after 1949, the exported minors were all of the highlight variant, which was a direct result of the American regulations of the time, which required the 7-inch sealed beam units higher in the wings. However, if you look at a Morris Minor in America for the entirety of 1949, from January onwards, you'll see that it's already a highlight, not a lowlight. And this is because before they made highlights a thing across the entire range, Nuffield made special wings for the American market only. So you can imagine that's quite expensive. And that then meant that they lost money on each car that they sent to America, and they quickly realised that to make it worth their time and to be exporting cars across the world, all the cars would need to be the highlight wing design. So essentially, and a lot of people don't know this, American legislation shaped the look of one of Britain's most popular cars at the time. Now, if you're wondering what the full story behind this is and how the mileage is documented and why it's so low and all the adventures it went on, the full story of the car and its backstory with the original family and old photographs is all on John's channel, which is Tempting Fate Tours. Put a link in the description box below. But in short, it moves on from this family and a deal is struck, and John agrees to buy the car and bring it to New York State in America where he lives. Now, this is all going swimmingly well. The original owner, or the current owner at the time, is very excited. John's very excited. However, guess what happens next? Lockdown restrictions kick in because of coronavirus, and it meant that all of John's plans were put on hold. However, rescue comes in the form of a generous 1949 Canadian Morris Minor owner. He offers to help look after the car until things get a little bit easier. Now, that might also be because he's trying to put his back together, and with John's being so original, it provides him a wonderful example of a car that he can base his own on. And he then looks after the car for John until I think it's November 2022. And at this point, John and his friend Tom make the 500-mile trip to pick up the car. And after nearly 3 years of patiently waiting, John gets to drive his beloved new 1949 Morris Minor, the one that we're sitting in today, which it feels bizarre that it's travelled so far. But John didn't stop there with his antics, and John is a man who loves to live life to the full. And early this year, he shipped this particular car to Europe. And then he undertook the Morris Minors on tour trip, which took us across Netherlands. You might have seen that I put some pictures up because I went as well. And we also tapped into bits of Germany as well. And he's now enjoying travelling the UK in it, meaning that this humble little 1949 survivor has probably visited more countries than any other Canadian lowlight. The car is strikingly original and even appears to bear the original ignition coil. However, it has benefited from a respray around 40 years ago. Now, this isn't due to the car being rusty, but because of paint technology for the maroon used on these cars in 1949. And what would happen is the paint would go chalky. It's not something you see on every colour from this era. And in fact, it was such a problem on the maroon, it led to the colour being reformulated 2 years later because Morris had had so many warranty claims on the paintwork. The car still has the original 918 or 918cc engine, which John cheerfully tells me will work itself up into that 50-mile-per-hour section of the speedo, but he's never managed to make it to 60. To conclude, this car is more than just a car. It's a stunning historical piece, and we are incredibly lucky to experience it here today at the Morris Minor Owner Club National Rally 2024. Coming inside here, my inner geek comes to life because there's so much inside this car that you won't see in a later car from later on in 1949. So that's how we immediately know that it is one of the earlier cars. So let me show you what we've got. And first of all, one of the things that I want to point out is just how very different the dash is in this to a later Morris Minor. Now you can see a picture there of a later dash, slightly modified with that panel in front of the steering wheel, but this is mine from 1968. So a lot of people have this misconception that Morris Minors don't really change that much throughout production life. And yes, the body shape may look the same, but it's when you start drilling down into these details that you start to see that things are very different indeed. Now looking in front of us here, this is our main panel. And in my opinion, this dash is so ornate and almost better laid out than some of the later stuff. But first things first is the central speedo that everybody's so familiar with, that they've even carried over into the modern minis, is now somewhere totally different. So it started off in front of the driver, which, as you can see with this 3-spoke steering wheel, can be a wee bit problematic to see if your steering wheel's here because you can't see where the needle is. Now, as you'll be able to see, the speedo runs up to 80 miles per hour, but we have no hope in any chance of making it up to 80 miles per hour. Really, this car is going to be comfortable sitting at around 40 tops, because as I was telling you earlier, that early Morris derived engine, was it Morris 8 derived engine? It's not got that oomph that those later 1098s have, which will take you up into those 60s and 70s. You've also got your fuel gauge on there, and you can almost sense those early Morris cars within this, because it's almost that Art Deco styling on these controls that you see within those earlier cars, as opposed to the later Morris cars that start feeling decidedly more mid-century. And now over on the right hand side, this is something that I really wish that had come in my car from standard, so much so that I had one put in when my car was restored, and it is an oil pressure gauge. And I was talking to the owner John about this, and I said, why do you think they put an oil pressure gauge into this but they didn't put it into the later cars? Well, of course there is the blunt answer, which is cost cutting, but there is also the practical answer in that the oil pressure on these 918 engines, you can't really muck about with it too much. The later engines are far more forgiving, those 1098A series, and you can get away with it a little bit more. The earlier ones, absolutely, you don't have as much room to play with. So watching that oil pressure is absolutely essential. Now coming into the centre here, any Morris Minor fanatic will tell you this looks very different to your setup at home. Now, I was talking about, we can tell that this is one of the earlier cars from 1949. And one of the things that marks it out as that is you see these pull switches here. Now, if you look at a later car from 1949 or thereon, before they start using the kind of the flick switches, you'll see them marked, but on these, they're not. So I keep forgetting what everything is. It's probably why they started marking them. So over in your far left here, you've got a choke. This one is your lights. Now again, these operate slightly differently to a later one. So in a later one, you've got 2 clicks down on a little flick switch. On this, it's pull out and twist. And with doing that as well, you automatically get a little light come on down here, which lights up your control panel. Now over on the right hand side here, this is your pull start. So again, a little bit different to those later ones where it's just your choke and you turn a key. You need a pull start here as well. Now, if you have looked at a later Morris Minor, you'll say, well, Steph, where are the wipers? Well, they're up here. So they just are on a little pull, and you'll be able to see they are the clap hand design. Now, you see that clap hand design carried over even when they go onto a single pane of glass. They take a little bit of time to phase those out. So I think it's about 1961 that you come into the tandem wipers that we're probably more used to, that you would see on a modern car as well. The other thing to point out that is, I believe they start phasing it out towards the mid-end of 49, so can't be too many cars after this, is this metal surround. Now this is really difficult to film, so I'm just going to have to kind of show you with my fingers like this. You can see it stretches right round. And I was talking to Richard, who you may know from many Morris Minor videos, and he was saying the reason they took this out isn't because of cost or anything, it's because it's enormously fiddly. It's really complicated, and when you're producing cars in their thousands, in their hundreds, and you're churning them out on a production line, you don't want too many specialist elements. But bear in mind, this is that exciting era where we start moving away from cars being something that maybe only the very upper members of our society have, the people with lots of money, and starts filtering down a little bit, and more everyman style people start having the cars. And cars like this are what many people first bought into motoring with, so it's quite an exciting period of time. But anyway, I'm going off on a mad tangent there. You've also got your glove box here. Now if you look at some of the later ones, I don't know if you could do this in 49, probably should check, and I'll do an overlay for you, but you sometimes see a clock here, and you open that just with this button up here. Now you can see there inside the glove box, and you might be wondering why I'm not opening it on camera. The glove box lid is really delicate, and it kind of takes 2 people to gently open it, and I'm not an octopus, I've only got 1 set of hands, and I want to be super respectful of the car because she is a lady in her advancing years. Now I know that you're probably looking at the steering wheel and saying, where are the indicators? Well, they're down here. And now that control you might recognise because you also see it on, I think, Austin A30s, A35s have it. There was something else that we tested quite recently that had it. It's a control that you see used across so many BMC cars. It's just quite a standard Lucas part essentially. And that is pretty much everything we've got. I've chucked in a bit of geekery for you as well. The other thing I should probably point out is this rear view mirror that is going to be good for man nor beast, because as you can see there, look at my finger, it's essentially 2 fingers worth of a mirror. It is tiny, absolutely tiny. What on earth am I going to see with that? But actually if I sit up, I can see a smidge of the back window. But we're not going to complain because it is a very nice car. Now the other thing that is really strange for me is sitting on this side of the car, because I've never driven a Morris Minor which is a left hooker, and it's going to be a really bizarre experience, but we do like new experiences, and I'm only slightly nervous, so that's good. Now to get this to start, if you've never seen this before, I'm sure you already have because many of you are just as in love with old cars as I am. Let me show you how we start her up. I'm going to give her a little bit of gas. So we pull the choke out a little bit, we've got the key, the ignition on, and we pull the starter. She's definitely in neutral there. Now these earlier engines, in my opinion, always sound a lot smoother. Have a little listen. It's a little bit lumpy because it's got choke out. Have a listen from the back as well, and then we're going to take her for a drive, which again, I'm only mildly nervous about because I've been told that, again, a little bit like that standard companion we took out the other week, it is a bit pudding stirry on the old gear change, but we're always here for a new adventure, so let's see how we get on. Right, let's go on an adventure. Okay, so confession, you're going to notice that we aren't out on proper roads today. But here's the thing, is that because this is a car which is registered in America, it's really difficult for me to get the appropriate insurance for me to drive it on public roads. So instead, because I got a choice, I could either not drive it, and I keep selecting fourth instead of second, is I had two choices. I could have either not driven it at all or driven it on private roads. So I thought I'll drive it on private roads and show you all what it's like. Now first of all, second and fourth feel very, very close to one another. So I keep accidentally selecting fourth. But as you can see here, let's take some merit from what we can get at a lower speed just driving around this private bit of land. First of all is the steering is incredibly light and the handling is very, very smooth indeed. Quite often when you take older cars down to lower speeds, you start noticing that the handling gets a wee bit heavy. Now I'm going to try, because you can usually get up into third gear without too much effort. I'm going to take us back round up here and try and get us up into third. The other thing I will say as well is the clutch is so incredibly light that it's really strange after being in mine, because the accelerator is heavier, the clutch is lighter, and it just feels totally bizarre. The other thing that's really weird on these is that in mine, the main beam light is up top left, and as you can see here, it's actually under my left-hand foot, which means I keep accidentally just brushing it with my foot, and I keep thinking, oh no. Right, let's try for third. And that's us up into third there. A lot of people seem to think that older gearboxes, it's difficult. It's not. You just have to make a more considered move. So as you change between your gears, I mean, you want to be doubly clutching down the box, but when you're changing up, if you just take a second, not even a second, you know, just a brief pause as you change up through, it just makes for a better gear change experience. And I think that's one of the big things that you take away when you drive a vehicle of this age, is that every movement just has to have a wee bit more consideration. Now, I told you before we started driving that I was really nervous about driving something where it was a bit of a left hooker, and I thought, oh, I'm not going to be able to do it. But actually, as I cruise along here, I've become very at home in my favourite vehicle very, very quickly. I've acclimatised, although we might have to change down in a second, and I've been told that there is a bit of an art to it. It's not the easiest thing to be doing. So let me see what I can do. So we bring it right down and we feel our way down into second, and that's second there. Now with this having no synchro on first gear, and remember we've got 4 forward gears in this, it just means that you don't really use that first gear unless you're coming to a complete stop or you're trying to set off from a hill. But now even as we come over these speed bumps, there we go, and back up into third again, you can see that it's an altogether attractive little car that is still offering a nice driving experience, because realistically not everybody is doing all the motorway miles that I do. However, that does come with one caveat, in that the mileage on this is extremely low, and in fact you might have spotted it when we were looking at Speedo, it's under 20,000 miles from new, and they're verified miles, by the way, so that is a definite thing, which means that we're probably testing one of the best examples out there in terms of wear on the engine, wear on the seats, on the vehicle in general. So it feels like it's not only quite an experience to be driving a left hooker, but also to be driving something that is essentially a well-preserved piece of history. I wonder if we can do it again, change down into that second. There we go. See, I guess the more I drive it, the more I'm acclimatising into changing down into that second. Now, I know that this has been a really sedate driving experience, and I apologise, but I really wanted to share it with you because it's so rare that you get to try stuff like this and you get to appreciate and experience something like this that that is so raw, that is so real, that I just had to share it with you. And I know that many of you feel the same way about Morris Minors that I do. I love them so much, and it's just everything about them. And is it even something like this that's so much older than my daily driver? It's nearly 20 years older. I'm still enjoying it just as much. And if I was just pootling around the local town or I didn't have far to go, I would be just as happy in this as I would be in my latest Saloon. And you can see why so many people went for Morris Minors. You can see why it was the car that was the first to sell 1 million units. It's just everything about it. And even as we come up here, you can see for everybody that comes in and says they have really great memories, that you still love them, you just appreciate that so much more when you're behind the wheel. I've really loved sharing this with you today. Now, the adventures don't stop for this car because it's in the UK until November, and it's going to be on show at the NEC Classic Motor Show, so you can go and have a look at it yourself. It's going to be on the Morris Minor Owner Club stand. And they've got lots of really interesting cars in November, actually. But you can also follow it online because the owner of the car, John Volker, who is an incredible man, he writes really well about automotive. So you might have read some of his stuff already and know exactly who he is. But if you don't, you should check out his YouTube channel. It's called Tempting Fate Tours, where essentially him and his friend Tom, who is equally as plucky and good fun, because I've met him, they essentially take old vehicles out, they tempt fate, and they go on mad adventures in these cars or these vehicles, and they really test everything to their limits, and I really like that, and I really enjoy their videos. I think you might do too, and I've put a link in the description box below. But that's it from me today. Again, my apologies that I couldn't take you out on the open road. I would have absolutely loved to, but it was either this sedate little drive or no drive at all, and I thought I'm not going to leave this piece of history off the channel. So until next Sunday when we meet again and we're back on the road to Great Britain, take care and drive safely.